Modern ghost stories. Take out the trash. Don't let it back in. The Friday night was dark, but out at the back of Buyitall supermarket, there was just enough light for Jeremy and Ruth to see what they were doing. They didn't want to see, you understand, because what they were doing was disgusting. It was the end of the working day, and they were taking out all the rotten fruit and veg, the unsold fish and meat and salads, and throwing them into a container. It was not a nice job. But the two teenagers knew they couldn't complain. At least they had part-time jobs, so they could make money for clothes and movies and hobbies, like collecting science fiction movies, Jeremy, and acrobatics, Ruth. Ruth enjoyed talking to the customers in the shop, and Jeremy's favourite job was putting up shelves with a gun that shot out metal staples. He thought he looked cool doing that, but the shelves did fall down a lot. "Jez, be careful with that sack," said Ruth. "I've got my new leggings under this overall. I don't want them to stink of old cabbage." Jeremy laughed and waved the black plastic sack at her before he threw it into the container. "Well, at least that one didn't break," he said. "It did stink, though." He shut the lid of the container and waved his hand in front of his nose. "God, so does everything in there. When are they coming to change this thing? It's been here for weeks now." "Johnson said the company that sends containers costs too much," Ruth replied. "He's so mean." The store owner was well known for not wanting to spend money. He made sure that none of the food was thrown away until the very last day on the label. Some people said that he changed the dates on the food sometimes, and Ruth could believe that. They sat on the loading bay. The big metal container stood by their feet. Suddenly, there was a bang. "Don't kick the container," said Ruth. "It's nice and quiet out here, after all the noise in the shop." "I didn't kick it. There must be someone on the other side," said Jeremy. "Who's there?" No one answered Jeremy's question. He got up and looked over the dirty metal box, but it was too dark back there to see anything. "No one's there," he said. "I guess something inside the container must have fallen down." The next Wednesday, Jeremy and Ruth were out back again. The supermarket hadn't closed yet, but they had been told to throw away some old food anyway. Someone had said that a health officer was going to visit, so anything that wasn't fresh had to go. Jeremy picked up a box of bananas and began to drop them into the container. He counted the bumps as they dropped inside. He put down the box and wiped his hands clean on his overall. "Are we all done?" he asked Ruth. "No, there's more. I'll go inside and get it. Ruth stopped talking. That sound. She had heard something. "There were bumps, Jez, more bumps." "Yeah, I know. I just threw a box of bananas in." "No, afterwards. After you threw them in. Something bumped in there." "Well, that's just the rotten stuff in there collapsing. There must be crap from months ago inside there now," Jeremy said. Ruth wasn't so sure. It hadn't sounded like stuff falling down, more like something moving. Jeremy came back with the rest of the food and began throwing it into the container, bit by bit. He said he didn't think Ruth could do a head over heels and throw at the same time. But she did, and she got the food into the container twice. Jeremy laughed and said that she'd won a trip to the movies, but she just made a face at him. "What are you two doing?" said a familiar, nasty voice. End of part 1. Time for part 2. "What are you two doing?" said a familiar, nasty voice. It was followed by a short man in big, thick glasses. "Oh, hello, Mr. Johnson," said Ruth. "We were just dumping some of the food." "My food? That's my food you're dumping," said the manager. "Did I tell you to dump it? And play at circuses while you were doing it? Put them all back now." Even the ones in the container?" asked Jeremy nervously. Johnson stared at the smelly box for a second. Jeremy was scared that Johnson would want him to jump inside. Seriously. "There's something in there, Mr. Johnson," said Ruth. "Something's moving in there. It makes noises at night." Johnson looked at her, then at Jeremy. He laughed. "Yes, right. Thanks for telling me that. Now, get back to work, both of you." He opened the door so they could go inside. But as they did, they heard a loud bump from the container. And a sound as if something was moving inside. They all looked at it in silence for a second. "Rats," said Johnson. And he closed the shop door. The day it happened, it was a Saturday, and Jeremy and Ruth got extra money for working on a weekend. At the end of the evening, Ruth was in the shop putting bread on a shelf. Then Jeremy came running in from the back of the store. Ruth, come out to the back. It's trying to get out," he whispered. What do you mean?" she whispered back. "It's getting out! The trash thing!" Jeremy grabbed her arm and pulled her out through the back door. Outside, Ruth saw that he was right. The container was open, and something was sticking out, waving like a snake. It was hard to see in the light, but it seemed to be searching for something. Behind her, the shop door opened. "What are you two doing?" When Johnson shouted, the snake thing stopped waving. It was still for a second. Then, quick as a flash, it came out of the container and moved towards Johnson, like an octopus's tentacle. It grabbed his ankle and pulled. He fell over and was being slowly pulled towards the container. Jez, quick, do something," cried Ruth, holding on to Johnson's arm. Jeremy turned and ran inside. "Where are you going?" as the tentacle pulled harder. Then Jeremy came back with a staple gun in his hand. "Okay, trash monster, let's see what you've got," he said. "Taste metal, baby." Jeremy went down on one knee and shot staples into the vegetable arm. Finally, he hit what looked like a cabbage head. And the tentacle let go of Johnson and went back into the container. Now, Ruth, before it comes back, close it, Jeremy screamed. Ruth saw that she'd only have one chance. She took a deep breath, got into her starting position, then took 1, 2, 3 steps. She flew through the air before she dived on top of the container, landed on her left hand, and closed the container door with her right. She stood up, and Jeremy clapped. Said Johnson. Well, you two can go home now. I'll give you 1 hour extra pay. Now I'm going to phone that container company. Johnson went back into the store. Ruth and Jeremy looked at each other and smiled. So, do you want to see a film? Asked Jeremy. Only if it's a comedy, said Ruth. No more science fiction for me today, thank you. This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. Our sound engineers were Calla Nielsen and Christina Burrus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Byrne. This was a UR production. Modern ghost stories. Straight to the top. Hi, my name's Amanda. I've always liked testing myself, seeing how fast I can run, how high I can jump, how quickly I can move my feet when I dance. I'm pretty thin, but I'm strong too. The guys know they can't make fun of me because I can beat them at arm wrestling. Most of them, anyway. I belong to my local climbing club. In an old warehouse, they've built 4 or 5 different walls with lots of holds. You need strong fingers, good balance, and concentration. One mistake and you fall. One boy did that once at my club. A long time ago, before I started climbing. He was called Chris, and he was the best climber at the club. He was always trying to climb the highest wall, the one with an extra bit at the top that sticks out. The club have called it the impossible wall. So everyone tried it, and everyone failed. But Chris wouldn't give up, so they say, even though the club owners told him to stop. You know, you never climb alone. You always have a partner. Someone down on the floor who's watching you, in case the automatic safety doesn't work. If you do fall, the safety leaves you hanging around in mid-air, looking silly. Your partner slowly brings you down, safe and sound. Well, one day, Chris broke into the club to climb the impossible wall. The dumb thing was that he went in alone. The next day, they found him on the floor, dead. Did he make it to the top? I think so. Anyway, no time to think about that. I'm halfway up the highest wall and clinging on with one hand. One toe is in a little hole to my left, but my right leg is waving in the air because it can't get a grip. After a few seconds, it feels like I've found somewhere to put my knee, but if I press down on it, I'll be off balance. Do I dare? You'd better be careful there. Push yourself out in your gun. I hear the voice. Not whispering, but not shouting either. It's just like someone chatting to me in a cafe. But I shout down to Jeff, who's holding my rope on the floor, just to check. Jeff, did you say something? Me? Says Jeff, who doesn't talk very much. No, not me. You all right? Yes, I'm fine. Just hold on to that rope. I lift up my leg and push and get to the next level, no problem. Ha! Then I do a dumb thing. They say you should never look down when you climb, but my mistake is looking up. At the top of the wall, I see the bottom of a pair of sneakers. Someone is sitting up there. At first, I just stare at the sneakers. How could he have climbed past me? I didn't see anyone. And besides, I'm the fastest climber at the club. Are you still down there? When will you make it up to the top like me? Says the guy wearing the sneakers. Then I see where he's sitting. He's sitting right at the top of the impossible wall. But how could that be true? I lean back to get a better view. Well, I can see you won't make it today. Bye, he says. Suddenly, I lose my grip. I've leant out too far. With a shout, I start to fall backwards, away from the wall. Down, down. Until the safety rope does its job, and I'm left hanging there, in midair. Jeff jokes about it as he lets me down, but I hate it when that happens, and I leave without saying a word. I see a poster at the club. Rick Sanchez, a professional climbing star, is coming to give us a demonstration. It's a big thing. We don't get many stars out here. He's going to climb the impossible wall. I'll believe it when I see it. On the big day, I make sure I'm at the front of the crowd. The star looks cool with a beard and long, dark hair, and he waves to everybody. He tells us he's going to make the impossible wall look easy. Yeah, right, Mr. Sanchez. Well, he starts off fast. He's 5 meters up in a flash and turns around and blows a kiss to us all. I stick out my tongue. Every time he stops, he tells us what kind of move he's using. 10 meters up, and even I have to admit he's good. Smooth moves, strong arms, and legs that he can lift as high as a ballet dancer. Around me, the guys cheer when Sanchez shows us another cool move. But now he's getting slower. He's come to the impossible top part of the wall. It's difficult because he almost has to jump to the next footholds. Not many people are skillful enough to do that, but Sanchez does. Soon he comes under the ledge. That means he has to climb out away from the wall. He's underneath it, spread out like a big X. He puts one hand on the ledge to pull himself up. We all hold our breath. No one has done this before. End of part 1. Time for part 2. We all hold our breath. No one has done this before. Well, Sanchez pulls, and the top of his body is over the ledge. It looks like he's going to make it after all. Then he stops. And his head moves backwards like someone's punched him. There's a pause and silence in the hall before Sanchez slowly falls back. He's halfway down the wall before the safety rope stops him and they can let him down slowly. Sanchez's face is white as he walks away, Someone shouts out to him to tell us what happened, what went wrong. But he just mutters the Spanish word, muerte. After that big disappointment, the club says no one should try the impossible wall anymore. They're going to tear it down next month. That's why I'm here on my own. I hid in the showers and waited for everyone to leave. Now it's just me and that wall. I check my shoes and my gear and the rope, and off I go. I don't have a partner on the ground, but I've got my safety rope all right, so I won't fall all the way, unless some accident happens. Come on, little girl. Come on up. I can hear his voice, but I don't look up. Somehow I don't want to see those sneakers. Not yet. I make my moves. I reach for the holds. I dig my toes in hard. It feels weird to be in this big hall all alone. I feel like a spider climbing up the wall. Like a superhero. 5 meters. 7 meters. Now 10. I'm up to the impossible part. And I thank Mr. Sanchez for showing me how to make the next step. I position my body just like he did. I take a deep breath and I push with both feet, grabbing onto the holds. I miss with my left hand, and for a moment it feels like I'm not going to make it. Higher, just a bit higher. The voice tells me where to put my hand, and suddenly I'm on track again. I climb up to the ledge and hang. Oh, my shoulders are so tired. I know I don't have the strength to pull myself over. I throw one arm over the ledge, searching for a handhold. I find something and I grab on tight. This is the hardest part, because I have to let go with my feet and just use my arms. I close my eyes, cry out, and let go. I throw the other arm over the ledge and search for that second hold. But it's not there. My fingers slip. And I can feel myself falling. Until something grabs my wrist. It pulls my arm. It guides me until I find the hold that is put there for a hold. I pull with both arms, harder than I've ever done before. I feel something on my back, helping me up. I make it up onto the top. And I lie there for minutes, just breathing. Slowly, my body returns to normal, and I sit up. I'm ready to say something, to speak to the boy who helped me. But I laugh at myself because, of course, there's no one here. No ghosts, no boy. Just me, sitting on a ledge, almost high enough to touch the ceiling. Oh, there is one other thing. A dirty, empty, lonely sneaker. This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. Sound engineers were Carl Nielsen and Christina Buderus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Byrne. A UR production. Haunting melody. The practice room was Rob's idea. He couldn't play bass guitar very well, but he did have good ideas, especially about style. He said rock music is all about how you look and what you say in interviews, not about the music. Which is good, because, like I said, his musical talent was crap. His dad was a member of St. Peter's Church, an old church with fields and a graveyard. He helped us to get the chance to practice in the church's basement. The church thought we would be playing Christian songs, but we do have one song called To Hell and Back, so that was almost true, wasn't it? We were down in the basement. That's me, Rob, Kev on the drums, and Charlotte, or Charlie as we call her, doing the singing. I'm the guitarist. So far we had 3 songs ready and another 2 half done. Usually I came up with the chords and Charlie would hum along until we had a melody. Then she would write the words, if she was depressed. She could only write when she was depressed. So, we're under a 500-year-old church. There's no one up there but the statues and the graveyard. What would you say now if a guy in long hair and a beard floated in through the ceiling? Said Kev. Hello, Kurt Cobain, I replied, and they all laughed. He was one of maybe 3 rock stars that Rob had heard of, so even he got the joke. And Charlie smiled too, which gave me a nice warm feeling. I always liked it when she smiled at me. We started playing. Soon Charlie was dancing around, humming a melody that fitted the chords. She danced and danced, whirling around with her arms spread out like a ballerina. She knocked the microphone stand over, but she didn't seem to notice, and soon Rob was clapping and cheering her on. Typical. Charlie sang louder and louder, with no real words, just sounds. She had her eyes closed, and she was getting wilder and wilder. It was time for us to stop, so I grabbed Charlie's hand, and it felt icy cold. She opened her eyes and looked at me. I loved it when she looked at me, but this time it felt strange, as if she wasn't looking at me, but through me. "Charlie, we have to go," I said. "Keep that melody in your head. We can finish it properly next week." She nodded slowly at me. Rob and I put our guitars in their cases and locked the door behind us. As we walked up the stairs and out of the church, Mr. Greaves, the caretaker, came up to us through the graveyard. He looked at us suspiciously. I guess he didn't like the idea of kids in his building. We walked past him and laughed as soon as we were through the gates. The next week, we practiced our 2 other songs, Fly Away and Clouds of Pain. But Rob was more crap than ever, and Charlie was, well, she wasn't really with it. She kept singing the wrong tune. That tune she'd made up the first night in the church. Rob and Kev began to argue, and they went out shouting at each other. After they'd gone, Charlie and I left too. But she went and sat on one of the graves outside. She closed her eyes and just sat there humming. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't leave her on her own in the graveyard that late, but I had to get home. Luckily, along came Mr. Greaves, and he promised to give Charlie a ride home. I said I'd call her later on, just to make sure he knew he shouldn't try any funny business. The next week, Kev, Rob and I were down in the basement. They were friends again, and they were discussing what sort of clothes we should wear on stage. Rob was talking about some kind of black leather gear he'd seen in a shop, and Kev was keen to see it. Then the door opened, and Charlie danced in. She wanted us to play the song she'd written in the graveyard, and slowly she began to sing the lyrics she'd written.
Look closely into my eyes, for they are blue as the sky.
End of part 1. Time for part 2.
Look closely into my eyes, for they are blue as the sky. My eyes, my heart, my soul, but my
it sounded beautiful. I didn't think about moving my fingers on the guitar strings. I was just lost in her voice. The words echoed in my mind. I wanted it to go on, and it did.
Secret of my love. Well, it's time for
We played the song 6 or 7 times. Kev soon worked out the rhythm, and even Rob played bass without me having to show him where to press down on the guitar strings. A miracle! Maybe God liked our music after all.
Our thoughts are empty. Graves of our love are full.
We couldn't stop playing until we heard Mr. Greaves banging on the basement door, telling us it was time to stop. As we walked out of the church, still singing the new song, we all started walking among the graves. It was as if we were looking for something, but I had no idea what it was. Charlie wandered almost all the way past the graves, until Mr. Greaves came out of the church door and shouted at us to get on home. That broke the spell. He said it was dangerous ground out there in the fields. We might fall into a hole. We laughed. 2 nights later, I got a phone call from Rob. It was bad news. The church had decided we couldn't practice there anymore because we had made too much mess. That's rubbish. We hadn't broken anything. Well, we met after school and discussed it. We were all upset. We just wanted to carry on with that song, and we couldn't do it anywhere else. But we had to go to the church to pick up all our stuff. When we arrived there, the vicar was there. He opened the basement, and we carried out our gear to where Kev's dad had parked his van. We were all sad, and Charlie sat on a grave and cried. The vicar asked us what was so wrong, and we told him about our song and how much we wanted to carry on. Rob got angry and said it was the caretaker, Mr. Greaves, who must have lied about us making a mess. The vicar said we should be kind to Mr. Greaves because his wife had gone away a year ago, and since then he'd been a changed man. For some reason, this made Charlie even more upset. And she ran, crying, out into the field past the graves.
Charlie, come back! Charlie!
Until the vicar helped us to grab her and bring her back into the church. He told her the ground was dangerous over there. There was an old well there that was not covered up very well, and you could easily fall into it. He was kind and asked to hear our song, but Charlie was too upset to sing. So she showed him the words. She'd coloured them in so that the first word in every line of the song was in blood red. The vicar looked at the words. In fact, he stared at them and his face went white. How did you write this? He said. Well, the words just came to me, said Charlie, who was shocked by his reaction. When I was sitting in the graveyard that evening, it was like I heard a voice in my head singing them to me.
Look closely into my eyes, for they are blue as the sky. My eyes, my heart, my soul, but my body is soul. My body is soul. In my heart you'll find the secret of my love. Well, it's time for us to know the truth behind the curtain over the rainbow. The halls of our thoughts are empty. Graves of our love are full. Oh yeah, the halls of our thoughts of our love, our food.
I looked over his shoulder at the piece of paper, and suddenly I understood. It wasn't our song at all. It was someone else's. A message, literally from beyond the grave.
Look for my body in the well, behind the graves.
This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. Sound engineers were Carl Nielsen and Christina Buderus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Byrne. A UR production. Modern ghost stories. Wraithlook.com. The word wraith can mean an apparition of a living person supposed to warn of his or her death, or a visible spirit. I was on my way to school. Usually I went another way, but not today. Today I wanted to walk past the little vase of flowers that somebody, not me, kept fresh. The photos tied to the fence, the cards, even the teddy bear. I didn't always want to look, but some days I had to. Christine had been my first real girlfriend. Most guys lose their girlfriends because they move away to college or something. Not many lose them to a car crash. I never saw Christine's body after the accident. I was away with the basketball team that day. But I can't get that picture out of my mind. Poor Christine. The truck ran right over her. Life goes on, they say, but it's not easy. Christine was blonde and funny and cute and clever, and I loved her. But now she was buried in the town cemetery, and I had to get on with school and sports and friends. One day, about 6 weeks after the accident, I got a call from Jen, Christine's best friend. She said she had something amazing to tell me, and I knew it had to be about our dead friend, Christine. When we met after school, I was totally shocked by what she had to say. "I've seen Christine," she said. "What? What do you mean?" I shouted. I was angry that someone would say stupid things like that. I had always thought that Jen was pretty dumb, but now I was sure. "I don't mean I met her in the street," she said. "It was online. Let me show you if you don't believe me." We walked to her house and sat down at her computer, up in her room. Jen said she had been looking up Christine's name on the net, just to see what was there. And she found her mentioned recently. So Jen followed the link to a site I'd never seen before. It was called Wraithlook.com. We opened up the site. First it was black, then it turned to grey, and then up came the logo. Wraithlook. Find your friends wherever they have gone. "What is this?" I asked. But Jen just looked at me and clicked on the next link. That's when I fell off the chair. On the screen was a photo of Christine, dressed in her favorite black and pink outfit, standing on a street corner. "That's just an old photo someone's found," I said. "No, it's not. When did she buy that top? A week or two before she died. And she was wearing it when it happened," Jen said. Jen explained that you had to be a member of Wraithlook to see the whole picture. She said that she had thought about it, but she had felt scared and stopped. Well, I didn't know what to say. It was time for basketball training anyway, so I went home. The next couple of days, I had plenty to do. Exams, a big basketball match, and helping my mom with a new bookshelf. But that photo, that stayed in my mind. Was it really Christine? How could that be? Was it just a hoax, or some company looking for money? 3 days later, I got a text message from Jen. She wrote, "Have joined site." As soon as I could, I called her. She talked really fast. "Martin, it's great. I found her picture. I found her. All I had to do was click on the like icon, and we're friends again. She wants to come back. She asked me if she could come back, and I wrote yes." "But Jen, think about this," I said. "How can she come back, for God's sake? She was crushed under a truck." "She'll come back. That's what Wraith looks for. Getting old friends back together again. I'll call you when she gets here." And she put down the phone. Sure, getting old friends together again, that's great. But when one of them is dead? That sounded totally crazy.
End of part 1. Time for part 2.
The next day at school, I hung around, waiting for the chance to talk to Jen. But she wasn't there. I asked around, but none of her classmates had seen her, so I guessed she was at home. Maybe she was too embarrassed to meet me. You know I would have been, after making a fool of myself like that. After school, I went back to Jen's home. She lived in a big, pretty house on a corner, with huge bushes outside and a pool at the back. I walked up the path to her house. Usually the people around here kept their gardens very clean, but it looked like someone had spilt some dark liquid along the path and on the steps on the porch. It was sticky. I rang the bell. No answer. No Jen or no Mum, not even her dumb poodle barking at me. I walked around the house a little bit, but I was scared someone would see me and think I was trying to rob the place. So I left and walked home, wondering where Jen was. Maybe they'd driven off on some family trip. Back home, I sat down at my computer. Maybe Jen was right. Maybe it was time to check this out. I logged in and went looking for the site that she'd joined. Wraithlook. Find your friends wherever they have gone, it said. So I joined up too, and looked up Jen's page, and there she was. But that picture... Jen was standing there, with her arm around Christine. I took a deep breath and clicked on Christine's tag. I came to her page, and there she was, standing on a street not far from where she died. She looked so sweet. She smiled into the camera. She was standing in front of a cafe. A cafe that had opened 2 weeks after her accident. Under the picture, there was a chat icon. I paused a moment. Then I wrote, "Hi, it's Martin." What did I want? Why did I get into all this? I knew Christine was dead. I'd been to her funeral. Maybe this was all some huge hoax. Maybe Jen was doing it to make fun of me. But what if this was real? People have always been trying to get in touch with dead relatives and dead loved ones. This was just some new high-tech method, I guess. What could go wrong? A beep made me look at the screen. There was a reply from Christine. It said, "Hi Martin, want to be friends again? Great, I'm coming." I felt strange. It felt as if the room was much colder. I could hear the wind outside my window and the computer humming, and my heart was beating. Outside, I heard something moving along the stony path to our front door. I looked out of my window, but I couldn't see the path from there. I began to shiver, and I wanted to jump up and run, but I couldn't move. I heard those sounds come closer. Then they moved up the steps to the porch. I heard a crash as something down there fell over. She had written that she was coming. Was Christine, or something that had once been my girlfriend, on my porch? Had she, or it, paid a visit to Jen last night? Had Jen let it in? Then I heard a knock at the door. Well, not a knock. More like something wet hitting the wood. My heart was beating fast. I looked at the picture on my computer screen, the sweet, smiling girl I'd loved. And before I could think twice, I clicked on the unlike icon. As soon as I did that, I heard a cry outside, and the sound of something sliding away from the door, down the steps, along the stones, until it disappeared completely. I was shaking. I got up from my chair and went to the front door, but I couldn't open it to look outside. I knew I'd see what I saw at Jen's place. Whatever had been out there didn't belong in my life, nor anyone's, not anymore. Later, when my dad came home and asked me what the dark, sticky stuff was on the porch, I said I had no idea. I'd been surfing on the net all evening. But I think it would be a long time before I ever went online again. This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. Our sound engineers were Calla Nielsen and Christina Budurus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Byrne. This was a UR production. Modern ghost stories. Taking the bus. Lisha had never run away before, but this time she had to. Life was so boring in the village. Nothing ever happened there, and her parents just wanted her to work at home, doing the cooking and washing. She didn't want to stay home all her life. Once an old man in the village had talked about life in the big city, and she wanted to see that for herself. So she ran away. She left school early and walked to the next village. It was a long walk. It took Lisha almost 2 hours, and even when she had come most of the way, she couldn't stop looking over her shoulder to see if anyone was chasing her. But she knew the rain would soon come and wash away her footprints. She was more worried that someone had seen her leave and would tell her family. But now she had arrived at the edge of the next village, and with luck she would soon be so far away that no one would find her. She walked slowly, avoiding the goats and little children that played on the dry ground. Soon she found what she was looking for, a pole as tall as a man, with an old metal sign on top. On the sign was painted the letter B. Lisha sat down to wait. After what seemed like hours, she heard the sound she waited for, the coughing sound of a bus engine. She jumped to her feet and grabbed her bag. The old country bus, still brightly painted in red and green and yellow, came to a stop, and Lisha climbed on board. She was nervous as she handed the driver money for the ticket. The bus rolled along on the stony, uneven road, while Lisha sat in the middle seat looking out of the window. At last, she was on her way to the big city. She looked out at the countryside, the green bushes, the oxen pulling ploughs, the hawks flying high, searching for prey. The sky grew dark, and soon the clouds had swept over like a blanket, covering the countryside and the roads with heavy rain. The rain spat up from the stones by the road, like bullets hitting a wall. Lisha was dozing, almost dreaming, when the bus came to a stop. Now was the trickiest part of Lisa's journey. She had arrived at the bus station, a huge hall, bigger than any building she had ever seen, filled with crowds of shouting people, bus stop signs, stands selling food and drink, and loud, smelly, smoky buses that went all over the country. She remembered what the old man in the village had told her about the big city bus. Take number 99. No other number. Only number 99. As soon as Lisha stepped down into the bus station, the noise hit her. The shouts of the people, the roaring of the engines, and the rain on the metal roof of the hall made it difficult to think, let alone talk. Nervously, she began to push through the crowds, sliding between legs and suitcases as the grown-ups around her pushed and pulled. She didn't know where to go, where her bus stopped. All she knew was the number that the old man in the village had told her, 99. She struggled through the people, trying to see the numbers on the signs. Where was 99? She saw some numbers, 35, 70, but none of them seemed to be in the right place. None made any sense. She tried to stop a grown-up to ask for help, but no one had time to look down at a girl or listen to what she had to say. Lisha was thrown around from place to place until she was quite dizzy. She held tightly onto her bag, hoping that it would all stop, until suddenly everything went dark.
End of part 1. Time for part 2.
Lisha found herself lying face down on the floor. She seemed to be on the edge of the crowd now, in a dark corner of the big hall. She was lying next to a sign, and beside it was a bus. Looking up, she saw the number on the sign. 99. She'd found it. She dragged herself up, grabbed her bag, and went through the open door onto the bus. There was no driver, so she went right in. It was dark in the bus and quiet. As she walked down between the seats, she looked at the passengers. On her left was an old lady, all wrapped up in scarves and a coat. Ahead of her was a man in a hat, and then a group of younger people. The lights were so dim, she couldn't quite see their faces. They all seemed to be sitting in shadows. Outside, the crowds were still moving about, shouting to each other. Lisha couldn't hear them, and she didn't want to, so she sank down in her seat and pulled her scarf over her head. After a while, the bus began to move, and it pulled away from the stop and drove out of the hall. Outside it was still dark as the heavy rain carried on falling. Soon they had left the bus station and the town, and they were on their way to the big city. The rain flowed down over the windows, and the lights in the bus were so dim she could hardly see the other passengers. She couldn't see their faces, but they were all so quiet. So was the bus. The other bus had made so much noise. Where was the engine on this one? She couldn't hear any motor noises at all, just the rain on the roof. She began to dream about what the old man had told her about the city, the sights, the temples, the boats, the fire dancers at the festivals. She wanted to see it all. It was much bigger and more exciting than her village would ever be. But after a while, Lisha began to worry. She was sitting on the bus, and it had come a long way, but no one had asked for a ticket. What would they do if they found she didn't have one? She stretched and sat up. She started to walk towards the driver. She looked at the passengers, but however hard she looked, she couldn't see their faces. They were like shadows. Lisha's tummy was turning into ice, and her legs were shaking as she came up to the driver. "Excuse me," she said. "Should I pay for my ticket? This is bus number 99 to the city, isn't it?" The driver, a big man in a white shirt and a blue cap, turned to her. Under his cap, all she could see was shadow. He pointed up above her shoulder at the sign on the front window. Lisha turned to look. The sign said 66. 66, of course. She had been lying down at the station. She must have seen the sign upside down. She was about to tell the driver about her mistake and ask him to take her back when there was a huge screech from under the bus. There was a bang from somewhere. The driver turned the wheel to the right, and the silent bus was suddenly full of screams. Lisha felt her tummy come up to her chest as the bus began to fall down into darkness. A voice said, "Hello, hello, are you all right?" And Lisha felt someone stroking her face. She opened her eyes and saw that she was lying on the floor, with a group of people looking down at her with worried faces. She could see their faces. Above them was the roof of the bus hall. She was still there. "You must have fainted," said the woman who was kneeling beside her. "There's so many people in here, it's hard to breathe." I was on a bus number 66, but something happened." Lisha was confused. "Number 66? Said a man in a bus driver's uniform. "That doesn't go anymore. Not after it crashed last year, in the rains. Down into a river it went, and everyone on board was killed." "Oh, you must have been dreaming. Where do you come from, little girl?" Lisha said the name of her village. "Well, I think we should get you on the first bus going back there," he said. Lisha thought of the little house her family lived in, and she realized at that moment that nothing would make her happier. This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. Sound engineers were Carl Nielsen and Christina Budurus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Byrne. A UR production. Modern ghost stories. The Crane. Craig could not sleep. That was nothing new, but tonight it was a problem because he had no batteries. Normally, when sleep was a problem, Craig would read a book for a while. But he couldn't use the lamp by his bed. His parents would see the light under his bedroom door. And they didn't like that. They didn't like it when he couldn't sleep. They didn't want a kid who was nervous. They wanted a normal son. Craig was careful not to seem strange. He didn't want to worry anyone, especially his parents. So when he couldn't sleep, he took a book and read it under the bed cover by the light of his torch. And at the slightest sound from the hall, like steps or arguing or crying, he would switch the torch off and close the book. Tonight this was a problem because of the batteries he didn't have. Craig lay awake. His mind was running round in circles like a dog chasing its tail. Outside it was raining, and the wind began to blow so hard that the window shook. Bonk went the glass, as if a bird had flown straight into the window, which would not surprise Craig because he lived on the 6th floor of his apartment block. The wind blew again. Craig got out of bed and went to the window. He looked out at the large space between his building and those on the other side of the giant hole in the ground. Craig thought it looked like a crater on the moon, a crater where men had landed, because they were building a new school, and the hole was full of machines and huts and piles of stones. And the crane. The huge, tall crane that was towering over the hole like a giant letter T. The crane reached up as high as Craig's window. It was pointing away to the left. Its lamps were on, but no work was going on in the middle of the night. Craig watched the rain for a while. But soon he felt cold, and he closed the curtains and crept back into bed. This time, sleep was easier, and he started dreaming a rainy dream. A dream about giant mice. Mice that had made a hole in his bedroom wall and stuck out their heads to squeak at him, louder and louder. One squeak was so loud and so close that Craig felt sure the mouse was licking his ear. He woke up, rubbing his ear to get the mouse tongue goo out of it. But of course there was no goo. It was just a dream. Thank God. Mouse tongue goo was nothing Craig wanted to taste. But there was a squeaking noise outside. He jumped up again and looked out. No mice out there. Nothing, in fact. Except that crane. Hadn't it been pointing to the left before? Now it was over to the right, over towards the shops on that side of the crater. Had it moved? Was that the squeak? Craig looked at the little cabin on the side of the T, but he couldn't see anyone sitting in there. It was night time after all. He must have been wrong. They wouldn't have left the crane loose so it would swing about in the wind, would they? Craig curled up, back in bed. He sighed and closed his eyes and pulled his bed cover over his head. He remembered how, as a little boy, he had built a camp by hanging blankets over the kitchen table and crawling inside, playing there for hours while his parents walked around pretending he wasn't there. Sometimes he would have a torch in there too when it was evening and the lights were turned off. And then there was that one time, that bad time, when he'd taken a box of matches inside instead, to feel like it was a real camping tent. Craig could still hear his mother's scream when she smelled smoke from under the kitchen table. But now there was a light. Even under the bed cover, with his eyes half closed, Craig saw the light flash through his room. He was scared. What was happening outside, in the rain? Who was shining a light?
End of part 1. Time for part 2.
What was happening outside, in the rain? Who was shining a light? He looked out from under the covers as it swept past again, shining through the blue curtains as if they weren't there. A floorboard creaked, and Craig heard the thing he was really scared of, his father's voice.
Craig, are you playing with your torch? Are you awake?
Craig kept quiet, hoping they would give up, but the door slowly opened.
Craig, are you reading in bed? We saw the light.
Craig knew he had to answer, so he sat up slowly and said, Oh, what? Dad, Mum? No, I was asleep.
But we saw the light from your room.
Yes, I saw that too. It must be the crane outside. It must have flashed past the window.
The crane?
Asked his father, walking to the window and looking out.
You're joking, aren't you? It's the middle of the night. Who would be using the crane now?
His mother turned around with a sad look on her face. Oh, Craig, I thought we talked about this. You mustn't make up stories, dear. But it was the crane. It must have swung past my window. It was over by the shops before. Perhaps they haven't locked it up properly. It's very windy.
So you're saying the wind blew that great big crane past your window?
Yes, it must have done.
All right, come over here then,
said his father.
Where did you say the crane was pointing? At the shop? Well, where is it now?
Craig looked out and saw that it was still pointing there. It hadn't moved. He looked up at his father and shrugged. It wasn't worth arguing about.
Don't start reading now. Back to bed. Straight to sleep. No messing about. Otherwise, you'll be sleeping in our room, on the floor.
His parents went out, and his mum gave him one final sad look before she closed the door. Why did he always feel so bad when they looked sad like that? It wasn't his fault that the crane was evil. He heard a bonk, the noise of something knocking against the window, and not just the wind. Had his dad left it open? No, the room would be freezing. Perhaps it was just his imagination. Craig turned over again, until the bonk sound returned, louder this time, much louder. He looked over at the window to make sure that it wasn't broken. Then he checked out the hallway. His parents must have heard that. He was not sure if he should get up. What if there was something out there, some monster hanging onto the wall? Then before he could think, he heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Yes, they were coming back. They had heard. This time, Craig had to have proof that something outside was causing the trouble, not him. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window, when there was a huge crash and glass smashed into the bedroom. Craig stopped. He could see a corner of metal moving as the end of the crane began to back away from the hole it had made in the window. He had to stop it. He had to prove it was really the crane. Craig jumped forward. He reached out to grab the crane before it left the window. He heard his mum scream as his hand grabbed onto the end of the crane, and he felt the cold, wet air as the metal moved, pulling him out into the night sky. Craig shouted something about being right before his window was a long, long way behind him. His parents' faces slowly disappeared as he was swept around across the crater. He looked straight into the cabin, and the last thing he thought was how nice and warm it looked in that little glass and metal house. But it was empty, very empty. This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. Our sound engineers were Calla Nielsen and Christina Bururus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Byrne. This was a UR production. Modern ghost stories. The Trip.
Welcome to your car. I will be with you on your journey. Let me guide you.
The sweet voice filled our rented car when Dad started the engine. Dad started laughing, and Mum smiled and said, "Oh, they knew who was going to drive when they programmed that voice." I don't see how they could have known. Mum liked to drive too, so she might just as well have been the one driving. But now she couldn't, because she had broken one of her arms. It was covered in white plaster from just over her elbow right down to her hand, so only her fingers were sticking out. I'm glad I haven't broken my arm. It must have hurt. Roads are dangerous. Mum and Dad have always told me that. So I don't cycle on big roads if I can help it. Even being in a car can be scary when you're going fast, but Dad's a good driver. I get a bit car sick sometimes, but it's better to have the window open a little bit. I like the fresh air.
Exit the car park and take the first turn to the left,
said the voice, coming from the GPS machine just under a map on a screen in the middle of the car dashboard. "Yes, of course, darling," said Dad, and he laughed again when Mum hit him lightly on the arm. "Be careful or I'll hit you with this next time," she said, waving her plastered arm at him. Dad just laughed again, and he drove out of the car park and turned left like the voice said. Mum screamed, "Look out!" And I just screamed as Dad turned the wheel off to the right as hard as he could. We just missed crashing into a car coming straight towards us. They drove on the left-hand side of the road here in Cyprus, and Dad had forgotten. Once we were driving safely again, we all relaxed. We were okay. Then I heard a giggle. I wasn't sure where it came from. Mum and Dad looked at each other and didn't say a word, and I just stared out of the window. But someone giggled, I'm sure. We had rented the car to drive around the mountains in Cyprus. Some people don't know there are mountains in Cyprus. They think it's all beaches and old ruins. Well, we've seen some ruins, boring, and we've been lying around by the beach and the pool. Fun, But now Mum and Dad are worried we'll all get sunburn, so they've decided to go driving. It's a nice car, and the idea of having a computer GPS was something Dad liked especially.
Continue on this road for 3 kilometers, then turn right.
There she was again, that GPS voice. Dad laughed again and we carried on. It was quite a straight road, so I looked out of the window and wasn't scared of getting car sick. I moved over to the side. Outside, the countryside was dry, like a desert looks, I should think. We came to some trees and some green countryside, just as the voice told Dad to turn right and take us inland, away from the sea.
We're going up now. Are you ready for the mountain?
Yes, Mum, I said. It's going to be fun. Will it be cold? Sorry, Anna, what did you say? I was reading this guidebook, she said. Well, I was a bit cross. After all, she was the one who asked the question in the first place. I told Mum so, and she told me she hadn't said anything, but I know she did. I heard it clearly. I went back to looking out of the car window. It was getting greener. There were trees and walls, and sometimes I could see through gaps and see farmhouses and people in black clothes. And even a donkey. Dad started making ee-ah noises, and I laughed, and Mum told him not to do it out of the window. Someone might hear him. So of course he wound down the window and did it even louder. It was really funny.
Turn left after 200 meters. Don't make fun of people here. After the turn, follow the road for 4 kilometers.
I jumped up in my seat. I looked at Mum and Dad to see what they would say. How could the GPS computer know what Dad had done? But they didn't say anything at all. Mum just pointed to the road sign where we were meant to turn off. Dad, did you hear what she said? Yes, darling, we're on the right road. Don't worry. We'll soon be at the top. No, when she told you not to make fun of people. Did she? Well, I suppose even local cars have feelings. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat with my arms crossed and stared angrily into the driving mirror. When Dad looked into it, he would be sure to see me and say sorry. But he didn't. He and Mum were talking about what to do on the mountain, and what it was called, and how many tourists would be there, and on and on and on. They weren't listening to me.
Turn right in 200 meters. You don't deserve to enjoy my island. Continue straight ahead for 2 kilometers.
Dad! Shh, Anna, said Dad. We're driving. I'm trying to drive carefully. You don't want me to drive off the road, do you?
End of part 1. Time for part 2.
I looked out of the window. We were starting to drive uphill. There were more trees, and when there weren't, I saw the ground was a long way down.
Keep following the road. The dangerous, narrow road. They can't hear me, Anna.
Did she say my name? I shouted. I made a noise without even thinking about it. Dad must have heard. Mum, Dad, she said my name. Just as I spoke, a bus drove past us going downhill. It was on the other side of the road, but the mountain road was so narrow, I thought the bus would drive right into us, right between Mum and Dad and straight towards me. The whole car shook. It was so loud. The bus was going very fast. It disappeared almost as soon as I heard it.
That was close.
Dad, turn the computer off. Don't shout at me. Didn't you see how close that bus was? Give your dad some peace so he can concentrate, Anna. car was really close to the edge now, and we'd come so far up the mountainside. I could see it was such a long way down. Every few seconds, the road would turn back on itself as it took us up the mountain, and Dad turned the wheel around to stay on the road. Every time, the GPS voice would make whooshing and screaming noises, as if we were on a roller coaster in a theme park. Mum, turn the computer off. It wants us to crash. Be quiet now, Anna. This is a difficult road. These turns are tight. Mum was right. And they were getting tighter as we got higher up. I heard the GPS voice laughing. Then we made a big turn and came out onto a straight bit. But I could see another sharp turn ahead, and behind it, there was only blue sky.
Drive straight ahead.
What was she saying?
Drive straight ahead. Do not turn.
Dad, don't listen to her, I shouted. We're almost there now, darling. Straight ahead and we'll soon be there, he said. He held hard onto the steering wheel, keeping it steady. Yes, straight on, said Mum. Then we can stop and see the view. What was she saying? We wouldn't see the view. We would be the view. The turn was getting closer and closer, and that stupid computer voice was laughing out loud. How could they not hear it? But Mum and Dad didn't hear it, and they wouldn't listen to me. It was as if they were hypnotised. I saw the red button that was flashing under the tiny map on the screen. As we drove towards the turn, I jumped up from the back seat, between Mum and Dad, and hit the button with my hand. The laughing stopped. Mum grabbed me with her good arm as Dad stamped his foot on the brake and turned the wheel. I shut my eyes. The tyres squealed. And our car stopped. Me and Mum looked slowly out of the car window at the blue sky and the steep mountainside. It is a nice view, isn't it? She said.
This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. The voice of the GPS was performed by Christina Leon. Our sound engineers were Carl Nielsen and Christina Buderus. A UR production.
Modern ghost stories. No substitute for life. Mr. Brown was sick again. Maybe it was our fault. I guess the strain of teaching us would make most people sick. But what did they expect? French was a boring subject, and you just had to play around sometimes. It wasn't anything personal. And as he was sick, it meant a substitute teacher, a sub. Subs were more fun than Brown, because they didn't know us. They weren't prepared for our tricks. Throwing paper, passing notes, making each other's phones ring, trips to the toilet, asking silly questions. We just liked a game. So we were excited to see who would turn up when we sat in classroom 110C. It was an old room in an old school building. The windows in our room didn't shut properly, and the books were all torn and curled up like old cabbage. Me, Mike, Davy and Janie sat at the back, so we had the best view and we could play around the most. So that morning, we were all chatting away when we heard a voice from the desk at the front. It was almost a whisper, but it was heard by everyone. I looked up. There was a teacher at the desk, although I hadn't heard the door. It was a woman, quite young, in a long black skirt and white blouse. She had her hair tied back in a bun and wore sunglasses that made it hard to see her eyes. "Good morning, class. Bonjour. Alors, maintenant," she started saying. "Je m'appelle Madame Lutin." Lutin? Didn't that mean rabbit? I asked Janie, and she giggled. Mike and Davy laughed too, and I collapsed with my head on the desk, laughing my ass off. Then, suddenly, I felt something cold, like someone had opened a fridge right in front of me. I turned my head, and right next to me, I saw the back of that black skirt. The sub-teacher was standing there, looking at Janie. I leaned back on my chair to see what would happen. Somehow, I was glad that it wasn't me having to look up into this woman's face. Janie looked scared. The sub said something to her, so very, very low, I couldn't hear it, even though I was only a metre or so away. Janie's face went white as the teacher's blouse, and she shut her mouth. Her eyes were wide open, and it seemed like she couldn't take them off the sub's face. After a few seconds, I felt that black skirt move away, and Janie sat completely still. "Janie, Janie," I whispered. "What's wrong?" No answer. She just sat there, and Madame Lutin was talking again. The rest of the class had shut up, and it was quieter in there than I'd ever heard before. Not even Mr. Brown ever made us this silent. I decided to do something about it. I made a piece of paper into an aeroplane. OK, it wasn't so original, but the classics work every time. I threw the plane, and I know how to throw paper planes. I've had practice. It was sailing beautifully over the heads of the guys in front of me, to the corner of the room. The class was looking up at it. Here we go, I thought, until it stopped. Stopped in mid-air. Then the teacher walked between the desks and reached up and grabbed it. She screwed it up and threw it away. And when she screwed the paper up, it didn't make a sound. "Oh, sorry, miss. I didn't expect air traffic control," I said loudly. Now, normally, the class would laugh at that sort of joke, but this time, not a giggle. "David," she said it in a French accent, which annoyed me. I stood up. "Yes, miss," I answered. "Madame Lutin," she said, as she moved slowly towards me. I felt my legs getting weak as that coldness grew around me again. "You have been naughty, little boy," she whispered. Close up, she smelt funny, old like libraries. "In my day, you would have been tied to a post so everyone could throw mud and sticks at you. But sadly, this is no longer so. Instead, you will report to the headmaster's office. Maintenant." She backed away, still looking at me like some 3D film effect. I could not stop following her, walking forwards, until I was outside the classroom door. Once I was out of the room, I began to think about what she had said. What did she mean with tying me to a post in her day? That sounded like a threat. I decided to do just what she had said, to go to the headmaster and tell him that I'd been threatened with violence. That would put her in real trouble.
End of part 1. Time for part 2. I walked down some stairs and along corridors, checking in through windows to see what was going on in the other classes. Over there was chemistry, there was music, and... Wait a minute. In room 45B, there was a woman with a white blouse, a black skirt and sunglasses, teaching some class of spotty 4th graders. I stood outside the door, trying to get a really good look at her, when the door opened and a kid came out. I grabbed him by the collar. "Ow, get off me," he said, but I had him in a good grip. "Shut up," I said. "Who's the teacher in there?" "I don't know. Mrs. Luton or something. She's a sub," he said in a shaky voice. Let me go. I've only got 2 minutes to go to the toilet, or she'll do something nasty." I let the kid go, and he ran off to the loo. So she had this class frightened too. But how could she be in 2 lessons at once? Did she have a twin sister, or was I dreaming? Soon I had come to the headmaster's office, and I was just going to knock when his door opened and something hit me. It wasn't like actually bumping into someone, more like an electric shock would feel. My thoughts stopped. Right in front of me was Madame Lutin. She looked me up and down and reached up to her glasses. "Aha, so it is you. You run into ladies like some goat on a farm. Do you know how to use your eyes?" She pulled her sunglasses down over her nose, but behind them was nothing. Nothing. Just 2 black, empty sockets, sucking me in like cold, windy caves. Everything went dark. I woke up in the headmaster's office. I was sitting in a big leather chair, and old Mr. MacDonald was waving a newspaper in my face. "Ah, David Miller. So you're awake. Good, good. And I think this time that you've learnt a lesson without hearing any lecture from me. So off you go. It's lunchtime soon." He sat down and turned away from me, as if telling me it was all over. But not for me. "Who was that woman, Mr. MacDonald? She was at my class, and she was here, and she was..." "Ah, yes, Madame Lutin. This is a poor school, David. We don't have any sponsors, we need new books, and some computers would be nice. But with so many teachers taking sick days, I have to bring in substitutes all the time, and they cost so much money. Now, don't tell anyone this, but that lady is the answer. This place has always been haunted, you know. Some ghost from the 17th century or something. A woman and her son died together here. In fact, there's a book about it in the school library. But you lot never go in there, do you?" I nodded. That was true. "Madame Lutin is saving us. A teacher who can take 2 or 5 or 10 classes at one time. And she doesn't need to be paid. Oh, apart from one small thing. I've agreed to lock up a student in the cellar next to her skeleton once a year." Now, your name is on my list of possible victims, so don't give her any more trouble. Now, off you go. I have reports to fill in. I left his office and closed the door. A ghost as a sub? No wonder a paper plane didn't work. How about if I made one out of a Bible page? Walking off to lunch,
I began to think up some new ideas. This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. The sound engineers were Carl Nielsen and Christina Buderus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Byrne. A UR production. Modern ghost stories. The Kennel. Lynn had worked at the kennel for a month. She had always loved dogs and was so happy to help out at the Lazy Hound Kennels for some work experience. She wanted to be a vet, so working in a kennel would teach her a lot. She climbed out of the bus in her boots and old jacket and walked into the kennel, to the cages where the dogs were kept. Some dogs stayed just during daytime, but others slept there while their owners were away.
Hello, Lynn. How are you? Fine? Oh, be nice to them today. Seems like they had a bad night,
said Mrs. Turner, the owner of the kennels.
Hi, Lynn. You're early. Let's take them out,
said Jackie, who looked after the dogs. Lynn smiled and nodded. She felt tired that morning, and the dogs seemed tired too. They weren't barking and running around like they usually did. She opened the doors and put the leads onto their collars. Lynn had to pull them out of their cages, especially Rascal, the little Yorkshire Terrier that was usually so active. The dogs didn't want to go past the door to the kennel's clinic, so they pulled Lynn over to the other side of the room. Come on, Rascal and Willie and Blakey. Stop pulling like that, King. Out you go, said Lynn. She almost fell into the mud as the dogs ran out into the fresh air. Later that day, she cleaned the cages with her big broom. Lynn thought about what Mrs. Turner had said in the morning. What had she meant about the dogs having a bad night? And why were they scared of the clinic room? None of the dogs were sick. She decided to ask Mrs. Turner the next day. It was dark. The humans had gone. In the other cages, her pack was settling down for the night. Rascal's ears stood up. That sound came back, the sound she remembered, the scary sound. Rascal didn't want to look, but she had to. The others began to notice. The Chihuahuas, King the Rottweiler, even old Blakey. All of them were staring at the door, the cold place. King ran around and began to bite his cage. Rascal felt her heart beating so loud it almost drowned out the whining she heard everywhere. When Lynn came back in the next morning, it was even quieter than the day before. All these dogs that used to jump up at her now sat still in their cages. They didn't want to go out, making it hard for Lynn to get their collars and leads on. At last, she got them out into the yard, where she let them run. But King was too strong. The big black Rottweiler weighed almost as much as she did, and Lynn couldn't get King out of his cage. Jackie and Mrs. Turner came into the dog's room and stood by the clinic door and the big freezer box next to it. They all stood looking at King, sitting in his cage, a rubber bone in his mouth. It made him look very silly, but he wouldn't move.
Okay, leave him in there. Maybe he'll come out in the afternoon, said Mrs. Turner. We don't want any more accidents.
That didn't sound very good. The dogs were meant to come out twice a day. Lynn closed King's cage, and she and Jackie took the others out for a long walk. Once they came out into the fields, the dogs began to act normally. The chihuahuas jumped over each other. Blakey sniffed everything, and Rascal played with a stick. After a while, they turned around to go back. But before they reached the kennels, Rascal stopped and sniffed the air. She whined, looking around as if not sure about something. Then she ran as fast as she could until her lead snapped tight. She went crazy, barking and pulling, then looking back at Lynn as if begging her to let her go. When they got to the kennels, all the dogs were crazy. Jackie was trying to calm them down, and Lynn was scared. She'd never seen dogs being like this. Jackie handed the leads to Lynn and went inside. The dogs went quiet, so Lynn heard clearly when Jackie said, "Oh no." Later on, the vet, Jeff, came out of the clinical room and took off his white coat. "It was his heart," he said to Lynn and Jackie and Mrs. Turner. "Strange. He was young and strong. I'm sorry, but that's all I can say." Jeff shook Mrs. Turner's hand and walked away. On his way, he noticed that Lynn was crying, and he patted her on the shoulder. "Shall I call the owners?" said Jackie. "No," said Mrs. Turner, in a voice that really scared Lynn. "I'll do that. Remember who has the power." For a second, Lynn thought Mrs. Turner's eyes were black.
End of part 1.
Time for part 2. Jackie went to King's cage. She started to clean it out, but Lynn saw something red under the straw. It was King's old rubber bone, chewed to pieces. If he had a bad heart, it didn't stop him biting through this thick rubber, biting it to pieces, Lynn said. "You saw how Rascal acted before out there. What's going on?" "I don't know," Jackie said. "I just want to clean this up and get out." She sounded hard, but she had to blow her nose twice when she was packing up King's stuff in a box for his owners. Rascal sniffed the others as they ran around on the grass. Rascal told them about what she heard when they had been out walking, when King's death howl had warned them of the danger he saw. That evening, Lynn went back to the kennels. She unlocked the back door. What was worrying the dogs? What had scared King to death? It had to be something in that clinical room. The dogs didn't want to go anywhere near it. She unlocked the clinic's door and crept inside. She looked around for a while, but the only unusual things Lynn found were a box of black candles and a sharp knife with a bone handle that wasn't really a medical tool. She heard the dogs making a noise and she went out to their cages. Lynn was shocked. The room was freezing. It was like the thermometer had dropped from 20 degrees to 0 in just a couple of seconds. The dogs were all growling or whining, all of them looking towards the clinical room door. But she'd found nothing in there. What was happening? Lynn had an idea. If she couldn't find the problem, perhaps the dogs could. She opened Rascal's cage. "Go on, girl, show me," she whispered. Rascal heard the other dogs warning her, but she told them she had to stop the danger. Lynn watched as the little terrier went closer and closer to the clinic. She shivered. It felt like something behind the door was waiting. Then, to her surprise, Rascal stopped before she reached the door. Instead, the dog stood and growled in front of the freezer box beside the door. Everything was quiet. Then Lynn felt something go through her. It seemed to run around the kennels, making all the dogs bark in fear. No, this must stop. Rascal began to howl. She howled as loud as she could. The sound scared Lynn more than anything she'd ever heard. Then the other dogs joined in. It was like being in the middle of a pack of wolves. Rascal jumped up and stood with her front paws against the freezer box. Lynn felt the fear inside her go away, and she walked up to Rascal and scratched the terrier behind her ear. Rascal looked up at Lynn with her big brown eyes. Lynn opened the freezer. Inside, she saw packs of dog food, and she reached in and lifted the packs until she saw them. One was a German Shepherd, an Alsatian dog. The side of the dog's head had been crushed, and the fur was covered in dried blood. Beside that was a poodle and a collie. They were all wrapped up in black cloth, with strange satanic symbols painted on them. Lynn remembered what Mrs. Turner had said when King was alive. "We don't want another accident." Lynn closed the lid, turned and picked up Rascal in her arms. She hugged the terrier tight and then put her back in her cage. She went into the shop to call the police. "This human has a good smell. At last, we can sleep." This ghost story was written and read by Keith Foster. The sound engineers were Carl Nielsen and Christina Budurus, and the music was by Nadine and Tanya Burr. A UR production.